Greetings, Gerbonauts. This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is episode number 12 of Project Alexandria, the history of spaceflight shown through real solar system. And it is now 1965. We left off in the last episode, 1964, with a Mariner mission on its way to Mars, and we will get back to that a little bit later in the episode. First, we need to start off with February 1965, when we are launching SA-9. This is a Saturn I sending up a command module as a test, but really it is about the Pegasus today. The Pegasus is a satellite that has gigantic panels that can detect meteorites hitting them, little micrometeors, so that we'll know whether or not we can have spacecraft survive out in space for any long term. Or would the sand blasting effect of these little things destroy our spacecraft? What sort of material are we going to need to use as we go forward with our space program? I have once again been working on my visuals for this. I'm using the latest version of RVE for Real Solar System. In some ways, it looks much better than it did in the last version, and in some ways, it's not quite as good, so I'm not sure which one I want to use. I may need to back up a little bit to get slightly better clouds, and to improve the look of the clouds over the land. You'll notice that clouds showing up over land masses almost make it look like the land mass is covered with water, not clouds. I did make one change. I changed what the texture was that's being used for the ground. So instead of lots of city everywhere, I have a grass texture, but that's not going to change the clouds. Another thing that looks better in this version is scatterer down at the surface. It provides much prettier sunrises and sunsets. Anyway, we're about to finally shut down after our launch here. Pegasus is in orbit. It's time to decouple the command module and release the interstage fairing, exposing Pegasus and allowing us to put out the micrometeoroid detector panels that are almost 30 meters from end to end, and equipped with 116 different individual detectors. The real orbit went from 500 kilometers to 731. I got fairly close to that. I'm going just above 300 to just below 700, but it's pretty close. This is the first of 3 Pegasus that are going to go up to do these detections. All of them on the last 3 Saturn 1s before we switch over to using Saturn 1Bs. These will be SA-9, 8, and then 10. Yes, those were out of order. They'll all be this year, but I'm only going to show this one as this was the first. It stayed active until 1968 and didn't decay and re-enter until 1985, at which point it came back in, burned up a little bit, and what was left over splashed down in the ocean. Pegasus in the VAB is quite simple. You can see I modified the texture one more time to make it SA-9. Other than that, everything is very similar all the way up to here, where in this point, let's pull all that off right there. Even though that is part of the final structure, you've seen everything from there down. What you haven't seen is that this was one that included a test of the launch escape system as well as the capsule. Now, I'll show the capsule in a future episode. For now, let's just take a look at the part of this that is the Pegasus itself. I created a couple new parts for myself. One of them is this outer ring right here, which allows me to create fairings. And the other one is this inner ring right here, which all that one is something that had an extra node up here that I could attach the command module to. The inner structure is just some basic framework there with some solar panels up top, solar panels on these beams that rotate out using infernal robotics hinges down at the bottom. I put the brains of everything right down there in the bottom, and then there were a couple beams that I'm not really sure even what they do, but I put them on here just the same. And then I created myself some special panels, some Pegasus meteorite detectors, since that's what this whole thing is about. And those stick out like that, creating this gigantic area that if little meteorites hit it, we can find out how much damage it's going to do to any kind of spacecraft up in orbit. And that's the Pegasus. Let's move ahead now to February 17th, 1965. We will launch ourselves in Atlas LV-3, Agena B, from Cape Kennedy, which is what I'm going to keep on calling it until they change the name back to Cape Canaveral again. This is Launch Complex 12, and we are sending up Ranger 8, built by the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. This 367 kilogram lunar probe is going to go to the moon and try to impact and take a bunch of pictures on its way down. I selected this one as one of the flights we're going to show for 1965 because these are the very first close-up, high-resolution pictures of the moon's surface. It had 6 television cameras, 2 full-scan cameras, and 4 partial scan cameras. The sole purpose of the entire mission is just to document the moon's surface before it impacts. I didn't cover Ranger 7 from 1964, but it too was another flight that headed to the moon. It took some relatively normal pictures of the surface before it impacted. One of the interesting things about Ranger 7 is that after the successful mission, somebody had been noticed eating peanuts in the control room, and from that point on, there was a peanut tradition at NASA. They would ceremoniously open a container of peanuts for good luck. Opening up those peanuts must have been good luck because this is going to be a successful mission despite the wiggling that you can see right here. This is a problem I've been having in version 104 of KSP. It's also not fixed in 105. The SAS controls just kind of wiggle the engines around a little bit too much. It overcorrects one way and then it has to go back the other way and it overcorrects and just keeps overcorrecting and wiggling back and forth like that. I typically solve the problem when I feel that it's wiggling too much by simply turning off the SAS entirely and trying to control it by hand. And if it still is overcorrecting because my controls are too strong, then I'll hit caps lock, which slows down how fast it can gimbal, and sometimes that helps. So we have put ourselves into an initial parking orbit, and now, just like the real Ranger, we are going to wait just a little bit before doing our lunar injection maneuver. I'm setting it up using Precise Node. First I dragged out about how much delta V I thought it was going to take to get to the moon, and then I used the little plus and minus for slight adjustments there to get a maneuver that would put me on a trajectory to head over at least close to the moon, even if I'm not going to collide with it. We're going to see here in a second as the burn has begun. Once this Agena has finished setting us on our course toward the moon, we will decouple the payload and the Ranger 8 will continue on by itself. If we need to adjust, there is a very small engine on the Ranger and we can use that for just over 200 newtons worth of force to redirect ourselves to where we want to go. Now, where do you suppose that's going to be? Well, that's another reason why I've selected Ranger 8 as one of our missions. We are trying to take pictures of the ground where Apollo 11 is supposed to land, and then we will impact at that site. We'll use those pictures in the future to get an idea of where we want to bring down our actual Eagle, the Apollo 11 lunar excursion module. So now I have to report a problem with my RSS. Well, just RSS in general, you see. Because we don't have n-body physics, things don't move around the Earth and the Sun exactly the same way that they do in real life. And as a result, the date in the game and the location of the moon, it turns out that they are incorrect. At the date that I'm supposed to be impacting, the moon is supposed to be full. But in RSS on that same date, the moon is a new moon. So I had to do a little shenanigans in order to get the moon shifted over to the right location. However, that left my spacecraft going off into the middle of nowhere now since the moon's not there. So a little bit more shenanigans, and I have the spacecraft now heading back toward the new location of the moon, even though the trajectory is kind of flashing constantly. It is going the right way, and we'll just pretend that this is what we had intended all along. Since all I did was rotate the orbit around, everything else is exactly the same. Previously, we were already impacting after our Agena burn, but now we are no longer impacting, and I guess in a way that could be considered a good thing because the real Ranger 8 had to do a mid-course maneuver to correct itself to get its impact into that Sea of Tranquility, and so we will do the exact same thing. After our mid-course maneuver, Now we are impacting right into the Sea of Tranquility as well. Along the way, we need to make sure that we keep our solar panels angled just enough that we can get the power we need to make it the 3-day journey over to the moon. And at the last moment, we're going to have to make sure that our satellite dish is pointing back toward the Earth so that the video cameras can transmit that data back. I'm using an in-game hull camera mounted up toward the antenna on the top of the craft. And from here, we will just watch as Ranger 8 makes its final journey, heading down to the surface, sending back those wonderful pictures, giving us the map we're going to need for the future, and then finally coming to its end. On March 18th, the Soviet Union launched Voskhod 2. On board are Pavel Belayev and Alexei Leonov. This mission once again beat the Americans to the punch by conducting the first spacewalk, and for that reason the capsule this time is equipped with an inflatable airlock. For my version, I have sunk the airlock into the side of the capsule to keep it from clipping the fairing. The Soviet version was lower profile and could be affixed to the hatch. Mine will extend out using infernal robotics and then inflate once it's in orbit. So just like Voskhod 1, there was no ejection plan for this craft. It was never intended to be used for more than one cosmonaut because it's just a modified Vostok. If anything had gone wrong, the occupants would have perished. But the Soviet Union wanted to beat the Americans to as many spaceflight firsts as they could, and this capsule is all they had while waiting for the Soyuz to be completed. Whoa, that shot off of there way faster than I had intended. Okay, anyway, the capsule. Since the design was for one cosmonaut, it was difficult to see and manipulate the controls inside the capsule. In fact, later before re-entry, the automatic navigation system fails, and to get the controls, one cosmonaut has to lay across the other and be held down while the first manipulates those controls. Then, during re-entry, Belayev had to open the chutes, and so he asked Leonov what their altitude was because he couldn't read it himself from where he sat. The 2 seconds that it took for him to look up that number cost them landing accuracy and put them 800 miles off course in some forested mountains where no helicopters could land to rescue them. They were stuck out there for 2 days. They had to chop firewood to stay warm and fend off wolves by night. But that's later. First, we need to do our EVA. After the first orbit, Alexei Leonov made his way into the inflatable airlock, and Pavel Belayev remained inside to close the door and depressurize the airlock. As you can see, I have tethered myself and exited my inflatable version inside the game. Here's a slightly more realistic look at what it might have been like to be Leonov in orbit. Leonov was tethered to the craft, so I used Kerbal Attachment System to tether my Kerbal knot. The spacewalk was 12 minutes, but the entire ordeal was about 20 because Leonov's spacesuit inflated due to the vacuum of space to the point that he could barely move his limbs. He could not access a switch on his chest that would have activated a camera to record his walk. He also had a hell of a time getting a camera off the hull that filmed his exit from the airlock. He couldn't fit back into the airlock, so he went in head first to try to make it easier, but then he couldn't reach around behind himself to close the airlock, so he had to depressurize his suit in order to reach back there, which gave him the bends like you would get from coming up too fast after deep scuba diving. All the exertion and inadequate suit cooling raised his core body temperature and gave him heat stroke. His suit was filled with his own sweat by the time he was done. Cosmonauts carried suicide pills in the event they got stuck in space, but in this case, they finally did both make it back. The airlock was jettisoned. The service module didn't decouple properly though, so they had a bumpy ride until the connecting wires burned through. They waited with the wolves for rescuers to come in on skis and chop down trees to make a landing zone for helicopters. The Soviets didn't send another man to space for 2 years. Our next project goes back to Gemini, but I need to catch you up to where we are. The last time we did Gemini, it was the first flight and it was unmanned. I've already skipped Gemini 2. That took place back in January, even before the Pegasus flight that we've already shown in this episode. Gemini 2 was unmanned and tested the heat shield. I'm also skipping Gemini 3 as well, even though that was a huge milestone. That happened 3 months ago, since my in-game clock right now shows it's mid-June. Gemini 3 was the first manned Gemini mission, the 9th total US manned mission, and carried Gus Grissom and John Young. They flew in the capsule nicknamed Molly Brown, which was a joke name and therefore the last time the astronauts were allowed to name their own crafts. Molly Brown was a survivor of the Titanic sinking, depicted by Kathy Bates in the James Cameron Titanic movie. Since she did not sink with the ship and she became somewhat famous afterward, she was called the Unsinkable Molly Brown. There was even a musical in the 60s called The Unsinkable Molly Brown. Anyway, you can recall Grissom's Mercury capsule had sunk after landing, so the joke of calling his Gemini capsule Molly Brown now becomes obvious. Yeah, NASA had had enough of astronauts naming their own capsules after that. They flew 3 orbits and returned home. So Gemini 4 is what we're watching now, and carries James McDivitt and Ed White. They go into an initial orbit of about 230 kilometers on average, which decays roughly 35 kilometers over the 66 orbits in 4 days. They took up a few scientific firsts, such as a sextant to investigate using the stars for navigation, but the real story here is that they attempt the first space rendezvous and the first US spacewalk. We'll start with the first rendezvous. If you keep an eye on my close approach distance indicator, you'll see that even as I thrust directly toward the target, after some initial success, I no longer can get closer to it. This was James McDivitt's job. He tried to use the Gemini thrusters to rendezvous with the spent Titan II final stage, but mostly he tried to get to it like anyone who didn't know anything about orbital mechanics would. He pointed his ship at the other one and accelerated. As we know from playing KSP, that can almost work when up close, but when too far away, it usually just changes your orbit and makes things worse. In McDivitt's case, the spent stage was behind him, so he was actually firing retro thinking he'd get to it, and this lowered his orbit. So he started dropping below the spent stage instead and went away from his target even faster due to the now lower perigee. To make matters worse, the spent stage was still slowly dumping its fuel, which caused small orbital changes. There were not enough lights on it to make out orientation, and as we all know, you need to have more lights. They also didn't have radar for range finding, and McDivitt's guesses at range were wildly different from White's range guesses. They ultimately gave up to move on to the EVA, but before I do that, let me mention that we're skipping the launch of another spaceflight first, a commercial geosynchronous satellite called Intelsat. It was very small and light, flew on a Delta D, and provided a relay for television, telephones, and faxes. Now, back to Gemini 4. After McDivitt's rendezvous attempts were called off, Ed White started his mission, highlight the first US EVA. They depressurized the entire cabin, and then after getting the stuck hatch unstuck, opened it and White floated out. He had a handheld maneuvering unit that looked like a gun and used compressed oxygen to get around. White did a few maneuvers that he said felt quite easy. The radio was giving them trouble, and White could only get relayed messages through McDivitt, who was on the channel to be able to talk to White and not to be able to talk to the ground. So when they finally were switching back to talk to the ground control was very frustrated with the inability to talk to the crew during the EVA, and ordered White back inside right away. White was reluctant to get back in, but eventually McDivitt coaxed him in. They had trouble with the hatch again, getting it closed, but eventually they got it sealed, the cabin repressurized, and then proceeded to spend the next few days running through many science experiments on little sleep. You can see the indicator right there for my Kerbal alarm clock showing me the date in actual Earth time rather than in Kerbal time. They left on June 3rd, 1965, and I am fast forwarding now until I get myself to June 7th, 1965, when they fired their retros to bring themselves back. The section we're dropping away right now is the retrograde rocket compartment. It also had some maneuvering thrusters around the outside edge and a cooling radiator. But other than that, little was inside that section. The service compartment has already been released. That was down at the bottom of this until we needed to do the retros. That service compartment contained all of our communications equipment, electrical systems, including the fuel cell, which we're using for the very first time to extend the duration of our space flight. If we were using batteries, we wouldn't have been able to stay up as long. They would have drained. And we don't have the solar panel technology we need yet in order to use solar panels to power ourselves. So instead, we use that hydrogen fuel cell. That section at the bottom also contained our drinking water, pumps for the cooling systems, more cooling equipment, and additional attitude control thrusters. And now it's time to revisit a previous flight. Do you remember this from the last episode? To give it the elliptical shape that I needed. Behind that was an omnidirectional antenna with a helium magnetometer attached to it. Yes, indeed, we had launched Mariner 4. That was back in November of last year, and it is passing by Mars, making its closest approach here on July 15th, 1965. It will pass within 9,846 kilometers in real life. Mine is a little bit off from that. And on its way by, it's going to be using all of its scientific instruments. Cosmic dust detector, cosmic ray telescope, a Geiger counter, ionization chamber, helium magnetometer, solar plasma probe, trapped radiation detector, and it's going to take some pictures. The story of what they did to deal with the pictures is actually quite interesting. Mariner 4 used a tape recorder to store the picture info, and they sent it back to Earth later at a slower rate. In fact, they took all the pictures before sending any of them back, because it was flying past Mars so fast. Okay, so the tape recorder was not the one that they had originally wanted to use on it. It was a backup recorder, and was showing some possible error readings when they were analyzing the telemetry. Also, Mariner 3 had failed when the fairing didn't open, so they were a little bit gun-shy about trusting Mariner 4's hardware, just in general. The team decided to check the first picture sent back by hand while waiting for the computer image processing software to do its thing and generate the real first picture. The team created a grid and divided it up by sections and essentially created this paint by numbers thing that they went and got hobby shop paints, and they filled in the image using this color scheme here. After it was complete, they compared it to the first computer generated image that ever came in, and when they were similar, they figured that meant that the camera and the tape recorder were working properly. That hand-drawn image was framed and presented to Telecom Systems Director William H. Pickering. All in all, Mariner 4 took a swath of pictures all through a strip along its flight path. Those images laid to rest any notion that there was life on Mars or even Martian canals. After flying past Mars, Mariner 4 then went off into a heliocentric orbit, and a few years later they lost contact with it. So it should still be floating out there, even today, just dead in space. We're skipping another flight. Gemini 5, the third manned mission, launched at the end of August. Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad are on board. In fact, Gordon Cooper now is the first person to fly 2 Earth orbital missions. It was also the first time that an American manned space mission held the world record for duration, because they were going to go for 8 days. That's the amount of time it would take to get to the moon and land and back again, and that's what Gemini was testing. That duration was enabled by the use of their new fuel cells. Unfortunately, 8 days is a long time to spend in space with not a whole lot to do, in the size of about the front seat of a car, and little planning on what to do with their trash. And so Conrad commented at one point saying it was like spending 8 days in a garbage can. In late November, France joined the International Space Group as the 6th nation to have a satellite in orbit. On a Diamant A rocket, the Army launched Asterix 1, named after a French comic strip character. And if the Diamant is not the most Kerbal launch you have ever seen, check out that debris that comes off the side when the protective shell falls away upon liftoff. So Kerbal! We're launching from Baikonur again, and like I did with the last Mariner Mars mission, I'm using a target dummy to know when to launch. We've warped time until the launch site has come under that orbit. I used Flyby Finder for RSS to get the proper launch window and inclination. Then I placed the target dummy in orbit so I could have something to go by while launching. If we can get into the same orbit as this target, then we'll be able to just burn straight to Venus. It's a Molniya launcher, which I had built for a previous flight, so I'll just reuse that launcher, but the payload is of course different. We're carrying Venera 3. If you recall from 1961, Veneras 1 and 2 tried to do this same thing, go to Venus, but they failed. Venera 1 never left orbit, and Venera 2 failed to send any telemetry, even though it probably did eventually do a flyby of Venus. This flight will also fail in a way. Its telemetry system will fail well before it reaches Venus, just like Venera 2 did. But in this case, I felt like it was a worthy spaceflight first anyway for 1965, because it's believed to have successfully gotten onto a collision course before dying. That means Venera 3 was the first spacecraft to land on another planet. Well, actually, I doubt land is the right word. If it failed well before getting there, then I bet it also never decoupled its landing capsule and never opened its chutes. In that case, it either burned up or was destroyed on impact with the surface. Either way, we don't really know. Here in the inset image, you can see how I packed in the payload. There's Venera 3 in there. If we pull away all of the launcher here so we can just see the payload, you can see that I put some, of course, lights all around the outside. Here's the landing capsule. This would theoretically decouple, and I have a parachute in there so that once it decouples it can land. I've put a heat shield on the outside of it, so it might be able to survive Venus. I haven't tried it yet, though, and I'm not going to for Venera 3, since what happens to this one is a mystery, and so I'm going to leave it a mystery in my game as well. We have our communications dish right there, of course, and I had put Infernal Robotics to rotate out the solar panels, as well as this arm here with the scientific instruments on it. We have some fuel bottles around the outside, some RCS so I could maneuver it around. Up at the top, more lights. And way up here, my guess is that this is where the maneuvering engine was to correct its course and to get it going straight toward Venus. So there you have it. Here are the Infernal Robotics joint names and positions and everything, and how I had set that up in case that sort of thing makes you curious how that works. These rotate out like this, and this top one rotates down like that. The solar panels are on the back side away from the communications dish because the dish would cover them up, so you can only see the panels from the one side, and that's the side that we have, of course, pointed at the sun. And then theoretically, the dish, when it needs to transmit, is pointing straight back to Earth. But who really knows, since it never really sent anything. So there you have it. Venera 3 has a close approach. I am now using the engine that's on Venera to make that final adjustment and get us colliding with the surface. This was a lot easier to launch than I thought it was going to be. I guess I'm getting used to that flyby finder. It makes RSS launches so much easier when they're going interplanetary. For our final mission of the year, we are covering Gemini 6 and Gemini 7. The numbering is effectively in the order that they're going to land, not take off, because Gemini 7 is leaving first. It's December 4th, and leaving from Launch Complex 19 is Gemini 7 with Frank Borman and James Lovell on board. The goal of these missions is to perfect orbital rendezvous and to test out long exposure to space. After a few days repairing the damage to the launch complex that always comes with any launch, Gemini 6 is scheduled to lift off and meet Gemini 7 in orbit. Gemini 6 will only be in orbit a couple days because their mission is the rendezvous. Meanwhile, Gemini 7's mission is to test long-duration space flights. It should take roughly 8 days to get to the moon, land, and return home. So Gemini 7 is going to stay up for about 14 days and prove whether or not there are any dangerous side effects of extended space exposure and microgravity. Rendezvous is complicated and counterintuitive, as proven earlier in the episode. Firing your engines when pointing at your target from in front of it will actually lower your orbit and make you go faster, thus increasing your speed and making you separate from your target even faster. So NASA had the crews practice in a huge hangar with suspended mock capsules and a docking target dummy. After months of practice on the ground, they're ready to try it for real in space. If they can't pull this off, there might not be a trip to the moon. Rendezvous was critical to the current plan for how to get home. Some designs had called for one ship to go to the moon, land, lift off again, and come home, but the cost of that plan was immense. So instead, they wanted to land a smaller craft, then take off and rendezvous with an Earth return vehicle. So after any launch, crew would need to refurbish the pad to get it ready for the next launch, and this process usually took several weeks, but we only have a few days to get ready this time. Gemini 7 will only be in orbit for about 2 weeks, and we're scheduled to lift off again in just over 1 week. The ground crews have to work around the clock to get ready, and on the 12th, the Gemini 6 crew will get all wired up and suited up as well. The rendezvous team is Tom Stafford and Wally Schirra. Things don't always go according to plan, of course, and today is one of those days. A problem with the engines causes them to fail before liftoff, and everything is shut down and the flight canceled. This is not the first cancellation for Stafford and Schirra. They were supposed to launch on Gemini 6 back in October, but the Agena target vehicle launch failed when that rocket exploded after liftoff. Gemini 6 was canceled and instead rescheduled to be a rendezvous with Gemini 7. So at this point throughout episodes for 1964 and 1965, I have said the word Gemini many times, and as I understand it, there are some people out there who prefer the pronunciation Gemini instead. Well, I've told you before, I like to be as accurate as possible, so I'm using the correct pronunciation that they used for Project Gemini.
Gemini, the bridge to Apollo, used a more advanced vehicle carrying 2 crewmen.
An actual Gemini mission.
During the year of the Gemini program,
6 weeks after the launch of Gemini 9, target vehicle for the Gemini 11 mission, seeing Ed White leave the open hatch of Gemini 4.
So I hope that settles it for you, and you can now stop with the comments about how I'm pronouncing it. Anyway, getting back to Gemini 6, you can see that they have just failed to lift off, and heads are bowed in despair because we're running out of time. It'll be another 3 days before we can try again, and if that fails too, then this whole thing will be a bust. Gemini 7 will be returning home before we could try a 3rd time. They called up to Gemini 7 and asked them if they could see the plume of the aborted launch, but they said they could not. Before we get to the 2nd attempt of Gemini 6, a submarine with Polaris nuclear missiles is going to do a launch test to see if Gemini 7 can see it and identify the launch with secret military tech. The US Defense Department is interested in technology that can identify rockets by their unique launch signatures, since every rocket style is slightly different, and then track those missiles and where they are going. Lovell said they could see the launch quite easily, and that it was in fact a little disconcerting to see any kind of missile heading up in their general direction. Okay, it's time again for Gemini 6. On the left, we'll catch up time to December 15th with a little bit of warp speed to match the right side, where we're already December 15th and loading Stafford and Schirra into Gemini 6 again. This time the launch is successful. The pad had been repaired, the engine problem fixed, and everything set up and refueled again in just 3 days. While we wait for rendezvous, there's an interesting story about Gemini 6. Toward the end of their flight, they made an announcement that they could see something in a low polar orbit. They joked about trying to pick it up on the radio, and then Stafford played some jingle bells while Schirra played on a harmonica. Supposedly, those were the first musical instruments played in space, and so later, those instruments were moved to the National Air and Space Museum, 1967, and they're on display with the Apollo to the Moon exhibit in the museum in Washington, D.C. Okay, in the left panel, we're almost caught up, and in the right panel, we're almost to orbit. When Gemini 6 made it to orbit, they were lower than Gemini 7, about 5 minutes behind them. The lower orbit means they are traveling faster, of course, and therefore closing the distance with every second that passes. But they will fly by too low if they don't raise their orbit. So, on the second orbit, they boost by 5 meters per second, which brings them a little bit closer. Then, a couple hours after that, they change their inclination with a burn at their ascending node. A third burn slows them even more, raising one end of their orbit to almost match Gemini 7. After several more tiny adjustments, they finally came into view of each other. At first, they thought it was the bright star Sirius because they were moving into the dark side of Earth, but it turned out to be the other Gemini. Even in the darkness, they were able to see the flashes of their RCS as they made tiny adjustments to get closer. And finally, there they were, nose to nose, side by side. They had plenty of propellant left to maneuver around and basically have fun, taking pictures from various angles, waving at each other through the hatch windows. The wires you see on the back of the capsule there in the live view, those were what used to connect the capsule to the lower stage to allow telemetry and control for that second stage, and they simply disengage when that lower stage decouples. From there, the lower stage takes over on its own, and any residual propellant in that stage was used to rotate the craft, spin it out of the way, send it on a slightly retro direction, and make sure it avoids any collision with the capsule and the crew. Speaking of capsule and crew, I was having a little fun of my own, spinning around, moving past the other ship. For the next 3 orbits, they hold their tight formation, 4.5 hours. It was just 4 years ago that Alan Shepard was doing the first suborbital flight because suborbital was all we could manage, and now we've got 2 craft up at the same time flying circles around each other. But the ride is over for Stafford and Schirra. Meanwhile, Lovell and Borman still have a couple more days to go. A couple of grueling days. Remember how the capsule was described earlier as flying in a trash can after a few days? Well, how about 14 days? Borman said that he was very ready to go back, but fortunately Lovell never lost his sense of humor and kept things as lighthearted as could be expected. Still, those last 3 days were, as Borman put it, bad. Not only was it rough conditions inside the cabin, but it was also boring. The incentive of rendezvous was now behind them, and like on Gemini 5, some of their thrusters were failing, and one of the fuel cells started to give only partial power. But the retros worked perfectly on December 18th, and they were able to make their re-entry and come down very close to their target landing zone. Although after 14 days in space, their legs were a little bit weak. Lovell said that as he was walking along the aircraft carrier, he had to keep on thinking to himself, right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot, just to force himself to walk because his legs just didn't want to function. They were greeted by the deck crew, and again the recovery for this historic mission was being recorded. And so that's going to do it for 1965. Until next time, I will see you later, Kerbinauts.